Hello, my friends. This is Deepak, and we're continuing our series on these amazing conversations with cutting edge thinkers, influencers, scientists, and what I call meta humans. And right now, it's my distinct pleasure to be speaking to Dr. Amishi Jha, who's written this book, Peak Mind. Find your focus, own your attention, invest 12 minutes a day. I have the book in my hands right now and I'm reading it, although I haven't finished reading it. Let's first start. First of all, thank you, Dr. Jha, for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, our audience likes to know a little bit about the background of the person. So I'd love for you to share where you grew up, where you went to school, and how you got to be doing what you do.
Happy to.
Before
So
we talk about the book, we'll talk about
yeah,
the book as well.
absolutely. It's all related. So I was born in Ahmedabad. I'll start there. We'll fast forward quickly. Which as you know is the town that Gandhiji's ashram is in, and when I was one, my parents moved to Chicago. So I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. Went to the University of Michigan for my undergraduate, where it was the first year that biological psychology was offered as a major, which is essentially a neuroscience major. While I thought I was going to be a medical doctor, I soon realized that was not for me, but studying the brain was really something that intrigued me like nothing else had. And that was it. I was hooked. I went to graduate school at UC Davis in cognitive neuroscience, did my postdoc at Duke in brain imaging, was an assistant professor at Penn, the University of Pennsylvania, for about a decade. And then for the last decade, I've been at the University of Miami, where I lead my lab and I lead a mindfulness initiative across campus. And I serve as the director of contemplative neuroscience there. So that catches you up to what I've been up to. In terms of just broadly the work I do, I study the brain systems of attention. And over the last, decade or so now, probably right around when I was leaving Penn and arrived here, I've pivoted toward, in particular, understanding how we can offer mindfulness training, mindfulness meditation training, as a route by which to strengthen attention in high demand, high stress professionals, from military service members, including special operations forces, medical and nursing professionals, first responders, business leaders, etc.
That's a very good summary of what you do. Background. I want to learn a little more, though. Any brothers and sisters?
Oh yeah, I have a younger sister who is done many things, and now she's actually made her way to offering mindfulness training. It's funny how these things happen. As an executive coach, so she's shifted in this direction, kind of around the same time I did. So it was not mindfulness and meditation were not something that I sought out to incorporate into my lab's work, but it ended up that out of all the different things that we studied, it was the one thing that continued to show beneficial effects in these extremely consequential groups. So, yeah, one sister. My mom still lives in Chicago.
And your parents are both living?
No, my father passed away when I was quite young,
I
actually.
see. And you have a family?
I do. My husband and I have two kids. One, and it's funny because that's what your daughter and I have been sharing. Our children are about the same age. So I have a almost 20-year-old and a 15-year-old.
I see. I see. Do you speak Gujarati?
Huh?
You do.
I
Okay.
do. I don't think you do, but I do.
No, but I've been exposed a lot to it. Okay,
Right.
so now let's talk about the book. You have
Sure.
some very interesting chapter headings. Introduction, may I have your attention, please? Attention is your superpower. Then the vulnerabilities of the mind and the failed strategies that make things work. Push-ups for the mind. Find your focus. Stay in play. Press record. I like that very much. Drop the story. I like that very much. Um, Go big. Use meta awareness to unlock your attentional powers. I wrote a book called Meta Human, so that makes a lot of um, fascinating sense to me. Get connected, feel the burn, the peak mind in action. And then you have a whole training course, week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5, and so on. So that's a little bit of the summary of the book in terms of chapter headings. And Dr. Mishi Jha is professor of psychology, director of contemplative neuroscience at the University of Miami. And she told you a little bit about her research. She's been featured at TED, NATO, Economic Forum, has been covered by Scientific American, the New York Times, NPR, and Forbes. So all these credentials will be there at the bottom of the link. But why did you write the book?
It's funny, you mentioned the training program. And the first reason I would say I wrote the book is because I finally wanted to offer as many people as possible the knowledge and practical skills we had gained from testing and evaluating and training high demand, high stress professionals. And, really this comes down to this important brain system of attention. And I love that, I love the meta-human, meta-awareness connection that you already mentioned. But this brain system of attention is one of the reasons I was so interested in studying it way back when I was even in my undergraduate years, was because I was fundamentally interested in how it is that we can modify or optimize the brain by actions we take ourselves, essentially neuroplasticity. And one of the very first kind of volunteer opportunities I had, even in high school, was in a brain injury unit. And that's what sort of hooked me on this notion of, I'm not so much interested in caring for people that are sick, though obviously I think that's a worthwhile endeavor. But there are patients I'm seeing just in my time as a volunteer who are transforming their own mind by their daily activities, including obviously physical therapy, etc. And it ends up that attention, out of all the different brain systems, is so capable of recalibrating the rest of what the brain does. So if there were ever a place we'd want to train to optimize functioning, it seems like it should be in this important brain system. And at the same time, we were learning a lot about the vulnerabilities of attention. So for example, stress, this perceived sense of overwhelmed, threat, when we feel threatened, not just for our physical safety, but even psychosocial threat for our reputation, our sense of justice, etc., and negative mood. All three of those seem to be like kryptonite for attention. So it would just completely obliterate the powerful influence that it had and beneficial influence it would have on functioning. And then I started thinking there are professions for whom stress, threat, and poor mood are not simply part of the ups and downs of life, but they describe the professional context in which they need to do their best work. In fact, as a physician, you know this. You cannot be distracted by the stress, threat, or even very difficult circumstances that you may be in, because you've got to do a job. But it is the case that according to the brain science, your brain, anybody's brain that's in those circumstances, would be vulnerable. So is there a way to train the mind to protect against this by how we orient to the situation, how we understand the situation, how we place ourselves within what's going on? And that's essentially the journey I describe in the book, is how is it that attention is so powerful? What makes it vulnerable, and what can we do about it? Which is what culminates in this program that we've studied for many years now in my lab, to offer core practices people can do daily in as little as 12 minutes a day to really ensure that they have peak access to their own attention.
So if our listeners read this book and practice these sessions, they will rewire, I think that's the wrong word, but they will change the landscape of their brain, the neural networks, right?
That's the understanding, yes.
And as a result, they will have what you call peak mind, which means high level performance without stress, and ultimately peak living.
Yeah, but I would say the twist on that, I liked the name Peak Mind for the book because it does conjure up this sort of, woman on mountaintop. I've gotten to the top. I've culminated in some peak experience. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm actually not even talking about dissolving or removing stress, threat, or negativity. The journey of this book is really to describe that our our capacity to function, our need to function, will be in the face of all those circumstances. And even so, we can function and we can maintain and retain access to our own mind. But this does not happen all that well by default. By default, under stress, we'll be caught up in ruminating or catastrophizing. But it doesn't have to be that way, that we can train the mind to be present, to be non-conceptual and non-evaluative when it serves us, so that we can get the job done. So it's not sort of a fantasy world. It's almost like getting the raw data of this moment is going to give you better access to what you need to do. And there is a route by which you can train your mind to be better able to do that.
My very special guest today is Dr. Mishi P Jha, a professor of neuroscience, professor of psychology, and director of Contemplative Neuroscience at the University of Miami. And this book is essentially a guide to neuroplasticity and how you can basically shape the landscape of the brain through training. And she has at the end of the book the Peak Mind Practice Guide, and it's core training for the brain, 5 weeks of core training. And Dr. Jha says all we have to do is spend 12 minutes to achieve everything she's written, 12 minutes a day, or exercise, 12-minute exercises to achieve all that she talks about in this book. Can we go a little deeper into what I might be interested in beyond the book as a neuroscientist?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, what a rare opportunity to have the chance to
And I
chat.
would love to know your opinion. So, my training was in internal medicine. And then I went on to do endocrinology and neuroscience, neuroendocrinology. And I trained with Seymour Reichland, who's now 96 years old. And he was then in the 70s. He was the professor at Tufts. And I had finished my training at Harvard, etc. I was with him. And he, as I told you now, he's 96. And if he finds a snake in his garden today, he still will dissect it and look for neuropeptides. And he comes once a year to New York and still teaches occasionally at NYU. So he's, in a way, not only my mentor, but a great example of an amazing brain.
Absolutely.
So while I was training with him, we also had, those interesting days. And there was a Nobel Prize to Rosalind Yallow and somebody else for having discovered what we call assays, biological assays for neuropeptides. And all these fellows and professors were talking about neuropeptides as the molecules of emotion. One of my colleagues was Candice Pert, who was at that time in Washington. She was a student in Washington with, I believe, George Solomon. And she one day used the word molecules of emotion. And I said, why don't you write a book about this? And she did. She said, if you write the forward, I'll write the book. She later went on to become a professor of brain chemistry at the NIH and so on. And then she died a little prematurely because of various reasons. She wasn't acknowledged in those days because she was a woman. She did the research on the opioid receptor, but her boss won the prize, the Wolf Prize. Tragic story, but she held on to her story, and that had many negative consequences. So I became interested in those days in mind-body connection, trying to figure out where the mind is. And even if we had a definition of mind and what's the relationship of mind to body, and now you're talking about something else, how we actually can change the mind and in turn change the brain. And so the question always is, who's the we that's doing it? And this brings me to what is currently being called the hard problem of consciousness. And, I've been doing a series right here with Don Hoffman, who's a cognitive scientist in University of California, and Irvine. He trained with Crick, the co-discoverer of the DNA, along with Watson, etc. And then, Crick, of course, once you get a Nobel Prize in one thing, you think you're smart in everything else. So Crick had two fellows. One was Don Hoffman, and the other was, what's his name? It'll come to me in a moment. And he said to his fellows, I want you to figure out how the brain produces consciousness. And he also had this essay somewhere, something very interesting. And so, Don Hoffman struggled for 25 years to figure out how the brain produces consciousness. And then finally, he came to the conclusion it doesn't, that the brain, like everything else, is a product of consciousness or an experience in consciousness, depending on how you define consciousness. And he wrote a book recently called The Case Against Reality. I've done about 15 interviews with him on the case against reality. And Christoph Koch was the other.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's got to be Christoph Koch.
Yeah, so Christoph went on, he got Paul Allen to donate $1 billion to create the Seattle Brain Institute. So, I've always felt that the brain is a human concept for an object that we experience perceptually. It's a perceptual activity like anything else. And that the brain is sculpted by experience. And it's created by genes, which are the experiences of our ancestors, literally. And therefore, what we call the brain, going back to ancient wisdom traditions, is a human construct created in human awareness. And that, in fact, it is the record of all the experiences of our ancestors and then the experiences we choose right now. And therefore, it's a symbolic expression. And now I'm coming to something which scientists, they kind of roll their eyes up when I talk to them. The brain, like everything else in our body, is a record of karma. Karma being the interpretation of stories of our ancestors and the stories that we identify ourselves with. And so who's the we that is doing all this? I'll stop. I think I've talked.
Just that easy question with who's the we. Well, first of all, yeah, those conversations are fascinating. And obviously, I mean, you say, he spent 25 years trying to figure this problem out. And then he ultimately said, yeah, it's really not a problem. It's just, it's all illusory in some sense and a construction of what's going on. I think that I will say what I find, I'm not going to really answer your question immediately, but obviously I will come to it. But what I find so interesting about you in particular is that on the one hand, we're having this kind of a conversation, which is regarding the sort of ultimate nature of things, what is known, what is unknown, how the frameworks with which we are engaging in our lives and our sense of reality may or may not be correct. And essentially, I think what Don Hoffman is doing is really destabilizing a lot of people's thinking, because it's like, what? There's nothing to hold on to. What do you mean that this is all, equivalent to virtual reality simulation, et cetera? On the other hand, my interactions with your lovely daughter and what Chopra Global is up to is so practically minded for helping people today in this moment that are wanting an optimal life, that want to live in a way that is fulfilling and aligned with goodness and essentially not costly to karma that can lead to proliferation of more suffering. And squaring those two is actually something I'm very interested in. So the chance to talk to you, I think, is to me a lovely opportunity to see how you do that, because in some sense, the dismantling of everything we know in our attempt to question it, and then seeing that in this moment, there still are conditions and realities that we must face, that human beings must face. Both are true, both are real, both are efforts that are worthy of our attention. So I do want to come back to that point. So it's interesting that you went in this direction. I love this direction. I love that you're pursuing these questions, and that you are destabilizing a lot of scientifically held truths that are requiring us to rethink things. From a cognitive neuroscience perspective, the notion of we as the curator of cognitive control, of intention, of goals, actions, etc. It's almost like we have passed the ball over and over again in terms of thinking about what that is. Like, yeah, look, we're experimenters. We're going to just tell the participant what to do. They'll come in and do it, and we'll examine the impact of us telling them. Pay attention to this part of the scene. Remember this face. Remember these numbers. Read this passage. We're being the we in that case. And then most of the scientific research has been in terms of understanding, and we've learned a lot, what happens in the circumstances when those directions are followed. But this fundamental problem has always bugged me. We're passing the buck. We are not really addressing the emergence of this intentionality, of control, of willed action, or even automatic action. And it's been so interesting to me to pursue it, but I'm doing it in a way that's probably very, very fundamental, and meaning early stages. And I'll tell you how I just looked at it myself. First of all, I would say, broadly speaking, my understanding is that these are emergent properties. There is no we. There is no little person in my head directing and guiding me what to do. But there is a dynamic, highly interconnected and emergent set of properties that exist in my mind that make something prominent in this moment. And the prominence is because of a confluence of factors. When that prominence occurs, it has consequences. So, and I think that's what you're asking is like, well, what are the mechanisms that lead to that? Maybe you're wanting me to just say something more regarding the notion of we. There is no we. I would say at this point, what we know, and the way that we've studied in my lab, is that the temporal contingencies really, really matter. So just to break it down, if you ask somebody to remember one face, and then a few seconds later you test them, was this the face you were asked to remember? And then on other trials in an experiment, you might say, remember two faces. And then same question, was this one of the faces you were asked to remember? Or three faces. You increase the cognitive demands, again, as the experimenter. What you find is that on the current trial, on the trial that they're doing, the more the demand, the worse their performance. It taxes the working memory system more. My question was, well, what happens because of that, right? If I actually upregulate the amount of control I need to use in the service of remembering however many faces, what's the leftover effect in the next moment? Again, trying to get at the temporal contingencies aspect. And what we learned is that it does matter. If the demand in the present moment is higher, the benefits for the subsequent moment are greater. If the demand in the present moment is lower, the benefits are less. So in some sense, it's starting to give us some kind of very fundamental window into the nature of these dynamics of what produces the we and the contingent nature of at least attentional control from my point of view. I know that's a very simplified answer, but that's the way that we're getting at it right now in my lab, is to look at these effects in terms of cognitive control and even microstates with EEG.
Your answer is brilliant from a scientific point of view, and your book is obviously going to be very beneficial for anyone who's dealing with the stresses of the world. And we as humans have created these stresses, of course. Just a question. So, obviously, very practical. The goal is to alleviate suffering, which is great, and it will if you follow these ideas. But may I go on?
Please.
With my question. So,
Yeah.
You were born in Ahmedabad, right? You said?
Yeah.
The land of Gandhi. And there's a very rich tradition that comes to us Indians from the Vedanta, from these amazing systems of yoga. And they too talk about the alleviation of suffering. And two questions. One is human suffering unique in the stress and the work ethic and the demands we have in various professions? Um, this is something that is part of our evolutionary inheritance right now, that other animals maybe do suffer in the moment, but they don't ruminate over it. You kick a dog and you meet the dog 5 years later, it might attack you because it has memory, but it won't plan for 5 years how to get even, which is a human activity. So basically, what you're saying is it is evolution that has created human suffering.
It has created uh, the brain in its current form that has the power to do things that dogs can absolutely not do: plan, prioritize, deliberate, reflect in very productive manners. So it's not just about ruminating or catastrophizing, it's regarding usage of knowledge and planful action. But yes, the other side of that coin is that those exact functions of the brain can be used in a way that is problematic.
And it's not just the problems I'm talking about. The entire human civilization, the entire human experience of the universe, from Wall Street to the concept of money, to the concept of nation states, to the concept of time, all of this is human, right?
I mean, absolutely, in a way that we don't think that any other kinds of animals can do this quite well.
And neuroscience definitely upgrades our ability to enhance the human experience. No question about that.
I'm with you.
And, then in
I
our
feel like you're building it toward a case I'm going to be crushed by, but keep
no,
going.
no, no, I'm not. I need your assistance. And, so yes, we upgrade the human experience through neuroscience. And everything that humans do can be upgraded in a more efficient way by paying attention to the principles of neuroscience, cognitive science that we've learned. And, every day there's more progress. You can track everything in the brain through new technologies. But would you agree? And now I'm going, because I want to address something deeper than what we call usual human suffering from stress, which is also, when I met my guru for the first time, we had a conference in Harvard, and Benson was there. He just passed away, by the way, Herbert Benson, at the age of 86. And the conference was on stress. And so after the conference finished, my guru, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, brought meditation to the world, in the West anyway. He called me and he whispered in my ear, he said, "What is this stress?" So I explained to him, it's the perception of threat, just as like you explained to me right now. He said, "Oh," he'd never heard the word. He said, "You mean resistance to existence?" I said, "That's very well put." But he had never heard the word stress, uniquely human experience, at least the way we experience it. But, there's something the Vedanta addresses called existential suffering, which says no matter how well you upgrade the illusion, the brain is ultimately telling us magical lies, right? It tells us the earth is flat. Nobody believes that anymore. It tells us that things are solid. We know they're not. It thinks the earth is flat and stationary. It's moving at dizzying speeds and hurtling through space thousands of miles an hour. All this we learn through cognitive science too. But I mean, most people would say that the brain is giving us the experience of an illusory world, but the brain is also an experience. So is the brain also an illusion? That comes to mind many times. But then, our wisdom traditions, the great traditions of Mahatma Gandhi and all his ancestors, said there's something called existential suffering that'll happen anyway. And, me, I'm now 75, and I've gone through the various stages of human evolution, education, making a good living, bringing up children, giving back. And now, as I enter the final chapters of my life, I have this great desire to understand reality. Not that I've figured it out, but the traditions of yoga said that, you can figure it out if you let go of every concept that you have. And that, human suffering, existential suffering, comes from not knowing what is real, number one, grasping and clinging at experience, which is ephemeral, transient, ungraspable, recoiling from the same experience, identifying with your self image instead of the self, whatever that is, and the fear of death. And these are called the five kleshas in our tradition. And the only way to transcend all of that is to go beyond every possible story, because what you call the body is a conceptual body, the brain is a conceptual brain, and the world as humans is a conceptual world. And do you relate to any of that as a scientist? Because you speak like a true scientist, which we need right now in this moment of crisis.
Yeah.
The illusion has caused immense human suffering and immense conflict in the world.
Absolutely. And I would, and one of the things that I will clarify is that my current field, which is an emergent and very new field, is something what we call contemplative science, neuroscience.
I see that.
Right? And contemplative neuroscience itself is attempting to bridge exactly the kinds of things that you're talking about. How can the wisdom traditions of the world, including those that you've described, inform a set of hypotheses different from what current Western perspectives offer? And it goes back to that thing I was saying to you a while ago. Essentially, there's these kind of questions that you're asking at the particular, your interest has been there, I would say, not just at this stage in your life, but throughout your life, but it's maybe more prominent now. And then wellness as the other perspective, right? And in some sense, these seem like one is very esoteric. It is really challenging the nature of everything we hold dear. The other one's very practical about living a life of goodness and wellness. And in some sense, the space between is exactly what we're talking about right now. The wisdom traditions, especially those that you're describing, are not just informing us that part of the reason we're suffering is probably because the nature of our clinging, grasping, and story making, but that there's a route by which we can relate to our experience differently, that those are in some sense optional. That is not the only way in which we need to orient to reality. And that there's a training path that we must follow in order to do that, because the default, and I would argue the built-in tendencies of the mind through the course of human evolution, guide us in a way that promotes clinging, grasping, and story making. And in many ways, it's served us for our survival. So what are the routes by which we can train the mind differently? And how can those be offered in ways that are practical and accessible by most people? That's been my passion. And that's why even the solution of 12 minutes a day is not some kind of culminating shortcut. It's saying, look, just like you could go from being a couch potato to doing a 5K to improve your health and wellness physically, you can practice something that is a different way to orient to your experience that will get you on a path to being able to experience more calm and wellness, because it taps in to the fundamental nature of what probably is going on, which is that clinging, grasping, and story making are not good for you, and actually aren't really giving you the true data of what life is and what experience is. So I definitely think that there's a lot that we have in common there on that. The thing that I think that has struck me the most regarding traditions versus modern life is that the existential crisis that people experience, what did you call it? The existential threat or existential
Suffering.
suffering,
Suffering,
is
yeah.
not something that we delay till we're in our 70s. It occurs at every moment of our life. We may not call it existential suffering, but we see hints of this throughout our existence. And the nature of how we address it, I think, are adding to the problem more so than solving it. But there hasn't been a lot of access to understanding that the way the mind is organized and the way information processing happens may be a root cause. And modern psychology, at least, and neuroscience don't even tap into it. So just to give you, you were asking me about my story earlier, and I wanted to just mention one thing. You know, I grew up obviously with these ideas, and many of your books in my household, you know, this is something that has been part of not just the traditions, but even modern life as Indians have and other people from the East have moved to the West. Um, it didn't speak to me. It didn't feel like it was practical or practicable in some sense. And translating it in a way that I could talk to generals in the army, or I could talk to fire chiefs or police officers or business leaders or mayors of cities. It felt like there was a big gap between that languaging and that framework and modern life. But frankly, for the last 20 years, that's exactly what I've been trying to do. And what's very heartening to me is that there's a receptivity and an ability to have this conversation. That if fundamentally our, for example, drive for consumption builds the way our entire society functions, and then we're seeing the costs of that in terms of climate change and the climate crisis. Oh, maybe there's something seriously wrong with the way that we're driving ourselves. Well, why is consumption the way that we orient to existence? Why is story making and um, uh, essentially hard conceptual framing, reification of things in the world so prominent? Well, probably because we were built that way. Our brains were kind of biased toward that. We can undo that, but there's going to be a path that you're going to need to follow because the drive by evolutionary design is so strong to do it in a particular way.
No, I get that. I mean, you're definitely making a major contribution through contemplative neuroscience on the alleviation of human suffering. What I am referring to is something that maybe not everybody goes through, called the dark night of the soul, which happens in spiritual and religious traditions, and I've experienced it. So, you know, still trying to cross over into what's across the boundary of human cognition and human perception. After all, you know, we live on a planet that is possibly one of 60 habitable planets just in the Milky Way galaxy. We're told there are 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, and uncountable possibly habitable planets. So if you look at the planet Earth, it's not even a grain of sand in all the beaches. And here is this species called Homo sapiens trying to figure it out. Whether that's humility or hubris, I don't know. So may I move on to one or two more questions?
Please,
and then we'll
please.
conclude. What's your take on psychedelics and the default mode network and all the conversation that's going on right now? Because I happen to be part of that ecosystem too. I've been taking people through terminal stages of life through ketamine and other things, and find it very gratifying, actually. What's your point of view on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have, for a variety of factors, just discounted a whole way of treating illnesses in the mind that we need to open up to again. And it was funny in my class. I teach a class called Mindfulness, Attention of the Brain and the Brain. And I was telling the students just last week that when I was an undergrad, we didn't know how it is that cannabis even worked in the brain. For example, we're like, it's got to have a receptor somewhere. We can't find it. So even Ananda minds, which I love that name, that it has Ananda in it,
Yes.
were not even discovered 30 years ago. So we're so on the edge of understanding. But what I think is so fascinating about the use of psychedelics, and of course, I'm not an expert on this by any means. It's not even something I would love to get into it, but not something we've been able to formally do yet, frankly, because there is a lot of limitations regarding access and starting that kind of an enterprise. I think it's opening up, but it's still pretty limited. But what my insight about it is, and I love you. I saw, I noticed that on one of these documentaries regarding psychedelics, you were there, and I was sort of like, my heart was singing because I was like, he gets it. He's a student of consciousness, and there are multiple routes by which that these doors can be entered. But what I would say that I find so interesting is that the unlike most of sort of traditional psychological therapies, which involve not which involve, let's just say what they do involve. They involve whatever conceptual terrain there is that is causing problems. You know, I think I'm a bad person. My life has so much sadness in it. To shift that over to a different set of content. So now, no, you're not a bad person. You're a good person. Your life is full of meaning. So it's taking that same approach of conceptual elaboration, but shifting the content of the elaboration. And what I think psychedelics are going to offer is dismantling the conceptual structures. And with that dismantling, there's an opportunity to potentially live in that dismantled nature or reconstruct it in a way that's wholly new that changes your orientation toward your life. And I think contemplative practice, in some ways, I would say psychedelics are a gateway drug to contemplative practice. That's sort of my takeaway at this point.
Thank you, Don. That's very insightful. I'm holding this recent issue of Scientific American in my hand, cover story, Origins of Space and Time, which is very close to my heart. But then there's a section here, psychedelics to treat trauma as well. So
Yeah.
it's becoming part of our conversation. This has been a fascinating conversation. What I'd like to our listeners and those who are watching this program, I'd like them to actually buy this book, read it. You'll get a lot out of it. I am going to read it more thoroughly. I just obtained it. And so I wasn't, maybe after I finish reading the book, we can have another conversation in depth. But I'd like our audience to also know that Dr. Jha is going to be contributing to the Chopra Global app. It's called Chopra. And we're very fortunate to have her expertise and her contribution at Chopra Global. So thank you, Dr. Jha, for that as well. And I hope we'll be speaking again and continue these dialogues. The book is Peak Mind, Find Your Focus, Own Your Attention, Invest 12 minutes a day. And check it out.
Thank you.